Hi, this is Gina Petrie, and I'm going to give you an introduction today to our Unit 1 in Second Language Acquisition. And before you watch any more of the video, what I want you to do is to make sure that you have printed out the graphic organizer. It looks like this. It says at the top, Graphic Organizer for ESLG 480 Unit 1, Introductory Lecture and Additional Materials. So if you haven't printed this out yet, what I'd like you to do is to stop watching the video, go to a printer, print this out from our Canvas site, and then when you come back, have a pencil or pen ready to take notes with the graphic organizer. Okay. So I'll assume that everyone watching from this point on actually has the graphic organizer ready to go. And the reason is because with these introductory lectures, just as if you were in a physical classroom with me, what I am always trying to do is to demonstrate to you how you can support your instruction so that English language learners who are struggling with language, who are struggling with vocabulary, with their listening skills, for example, are able to understand you. They're able to take in the information because you're supporting it in ways that make it comprehensible to them. So as I do each of these lectures and even the introductions that I did to the course, you might notice that I'm using certain strategies and supporting the learning. So today what I'm going to do is to support it with this graphic organizer. And I'm actually going to use it with you just as you could use a graphic organizer with your students. So before we get started, what I want you to do is to take a moment and look over what's written on the paper and see what predictions you can make about what you're going to hear in the lecture today. So I'm thinking that probably your responses around what you can predict, you probably notice that there seem to be two distinct columns here: information about internal factors, information about external factors. And you probably, based on your educational background and your literacy in English, in which we know it reads left to right, you probably can even guess that what you're going to hear about first are internal factors, and then later in the lecture you're going to hear about the external factors. Also, as you look through here, you probably see some categories with what you might call details. For example, personality, you probably can see that there are 4 different dimensions that we're going to talk about there. And language learning strategies, you probably can guess that we're going to learn about these 6. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. And what I'd like you to do is, as I'm talking, support your learning, support your understanding and your listening by taking notes on the graphic organizer. So very quickly, when you take a look at a graphic organizer before listening, before reading, that sort of thing, it's called an advanced organizer, and that's the way we just used it, is for me to check in and have you notice what are your predictions before we even begin the lecture. So take notes, and then we'll talk about this at the end. All right. So where we're starting in Unit 1 is to talk about individual differences. What makes one language learner different from another? As I said in the introduction to this course when I was talking about Unit 1, one of the goals is to help you begin to notice and pay attention to those aspects of a language learner that make them unique, that make them different than the next person in class next to them. So again, my goal for you at the end of this unit is for you to, when you walk into a classroom of students, not to see a classroom of students, but rather to see a classroom of individual students. and for you to begin to have almost a framework in your mind of the kinds of things you need to ask about, find out about, pay attention to, so that you can create instruction that meets students' needs. And where you need to, you can accommodate for certain students. Okay, so what are the kinds of things that professionals in this field think about when they're thinking about language learners? Well, as you can guess from the graphic organizer, there are factors that we pay attention to that we think of as within the student, and then there are factors that are surrounding the student. Now, there's a few places where this gets a little gray, and we'll talk about that, but to keep it neat and tidy, or at least try to, we'll talk about those things within the student, those things without the student. So within a student, one thing that we need to talk about right away is something called aptitude. And you probably have a sense that aptitude means being apt at something, being good at something, having a gift for something. And that is true for this. This means language learning aptitude. And this is an idea, a concept that some people, the way that they learn languages, the way that their brains actually process and make sense of languages, makes them more adept at it than other people. It's easier for them than with other people. And so this is the idea of language aptitude. If any of you have had experience in the military and you at some point thought that you would like to work with a language, you would like to be a language specialist within the military or a government organization, you would have taken a language aptitude test. They do exist. And there is a belief that there is this thing that makes one person, it just makes it easier for them to learn languages than others. So what does that mean? What makes one person better at it than someone else? One of the dimensions is better listening ability. So being able to discern sounds very closely, being able to discern sounds from each other, having an excellent memory, that is another. Noticing patterns, and that makes sense, right? Because when you're listening to a language, when you're listening, especially in those first few days, weeks, months, you're starting to notice, oh, a lot of words end this way. Well, someone who has a really strong language aptitude, they might have noticed that almost immediately, whereas for others it would take them a little bit longer. So there's a few other aspects of language aptitude, but essentially it's really great listening ability, great memory, and great ability to discern patterns. Now, the two factors that I have at the top of your graphic organizer for internal factors, these are actually the least important factors in this entire list. Now, if we were to go out and talk with a crowd of people, like if I were to go out right now to the mall here on Cheney's campus and ask people, what do you think makes a great language learner? My guess is that a lot of people would talk, maybe they wouldn't have the word aptitude, but that's what they would express that. Well, they just have this way in their brains of learning language faster. And the next thing they would say is being a child, that children learn language faster. So popular culture supports that idea that having this natural aptitude and being a child is what matters for learning a language. But actually, in the end, all the other factors kind of dance circles around those two. And so as we keep walking through this list, the factors that make the biggest difference for students, for language learners, they will be towards the end. So the second one that I have listed here is age. And you might have guessed, just like I think many people would, that a child is a much better language learner than an adult. And what we now realize is that often what looks like children being better language learners is really an external factor. So let's say, for example, you have a child who arrives in the U.S. and is learning English, and that child comes with a parent. an adult who's learning English as well. So the child will be placed in a school situation. Maybe they have before school care and after school care, and they're playing games, and they have recess, and there's lunch, and there are all of these games that they naturally are motivated to be a part of, and most of those games have physical clues, physical cues on what needs to happen. So students, for example, will hear, if they're out playing softball with their friends, they'll hear over and over again, "You're next, you're next." And every time they hear that said to someone, they see that person go up to bat. So they are living and breathing and studying in an environment in which there's all of these natural cues and clues around them that tell them what language really means. And also, especially if the kids are kindergartners or first graders or even preschoolers, they will often be surrounded with really rich print on the walls, environmental print. And often there will be a word with a picture that goes with it. And so there's all these automatic cues, all these automatic ways for the child to make sense of what they see. Okay, so that's the child's world. And let's go to the adult's world. So the adult has to somehow come up with a way to make a living for the family, and often may work 2 jobs. And so they spend maybe 16 hours a day working, entirely focused on doing whatever those little tasks are, those kind of restrained tasks. Maybe they're working in making food or working in a factory or something like that. And so they might hear some language that's associated with that, but not very much. And often the adults don't even have the time to take an English class. And if they do have the time, it's in the evening and they're half asleep. And they're worried about their kids who are at home alone. And if they do take an English class, it may be very abstract. There's probably not any rich pictures up on the wall. And the assumption will be that the adults are very educated, that they have lots of educational background and rich experiences that they bring with them. And so the teacher may not, in the way that they could, may not support that learning. So when we go back to age, it helps us to think about the environment that a child and an adult find themselves in as language learners. And we start to realize there's not naturally an advantage of being a child learner. There's all these other things that make being a child learner an easier time to learn language because of the way we set it up. Now, the one thing that it is easier for children to pick up is pronunciation. The earlier you begin learning a language, the less likely you are to have a discernible accent by the time you are an adult. Whereas it takes huge effort on the part of an adult to get rid of. Not that anyone should or would want to get rid of an accent, but it takes a lot of work to reduce an accent from a language other than English. So related to age, one thing that we have to think about is what's the previous educational background of the student and what are their previous life experiences. Often adults have already a wonderful educational background behind them. They have created outlines, they've created plans, they have given speeches, they know how to study for a test. There are all these things that they know how to do, and now you're teaching them English, they're going to apply all of that. And in that way, they can often dance circles around what children can do. And also previous life experiences. Adults have often figured out how they can personally handle stress, how they can personally handle when they hit a challenge and they're not exactly sure how to get around it. Again, that's something that, say, a 7-year-old won't bring to the table, and when they come to a difficult challenge, they may stop. Whereas an adult who's already figured out how to get past this kind of thing, they can keep going. So age is, if we were in popular culture, age is a really important factor. And I think people would say it's a very simple one. And what I hope I've just done for you is to complicate it a little bit so you see it's not a very significant factor, and that actually what adults bring to the table can actually make a bigger difference, and they can learn language faster. Okay, so let's talk about personality. There are 4 dimensions of personality that show up in second language acquisition research when we're looking at what makes one language learner different from another. So one of them is risk-taking. Now, I think this one will make sense to you if you think about it. A risk-taker will be someone who they are in a situation where another language like English is being used, and they'll think, I wonder what that person meant. And a risk-taker will ask. They'll seek them out. Or they'll be sitting next to someone on the bus, a stranger, and they'll just feel like talking. And so they'll think, I'm going to try it. I'm going to try my social language today. And so they will strike up a conversation. What we know is that risk takers expose themselves to lots more opportunities to take in input, so to take in the language, for example, English, and they also give themselves lots more opportunities to actually try out that language as well. And so risk takers will say, you know, I'd really love to hear, I'd feel like going to a play. Of course, all the plays are in English. I'm going to try it. I'm just going to do it. And so they seek that out, and maybe they even sit next to someone, strike up a conversation with that person. And so what happens is they create all these opportunities for them to take in language and for them to try out their language and to see if it works, see if their assumptions about how English works are working. The next one I have listed there is tolerance of ambiguity. Ambiguity means it's not clear. Not sure. You're not sure about it. And tolerance of ambiguity means that when there's lack of clarity, when you don't know for certain, you can handle it. That it's something that you can just kind of take in and keep moving somehow. And I think that comes down to a personal reserve, a personal sense within the person that it's going to be okay, that I can still carry out whatever I'm trying to do here, even if there's this one part I don't understand. This happens to me often when I'm in Nicaragua. I am connected with a school, Escuela San Miguel, in a little village in Nicaragua, in Cardenas. And when I am there, I am often a part of teachers' meetings. And the director of the school speaks very little English, so all of the, and many of the teachers don't speak any English at all. And so all of the teachers' meetings are in Spanish. And I actually understand quite a lot now, even though I've just been studying Spanish for 4 years. But always there are things I don't know what they mean. And I'm a risk taker, so I will often ask, Jacobo, what did that mean? What does this word mean? And I will often give it back to them. So what you're saying is to kind of try out my understanding. But I can't do that all the time. I can't interrupt the meetings all the time. I just have to have a personal sense within myself. It's okay. It's okay I don't understand everything. I just need to understand enough. That's tolerance of ambiguity. Self-esteem refers to having a sense that you're going to be successful at this, that you're trying, that your efforts are paying off, and that you will be successful. And one thing that we know is that some people, that is just a trait that they carry. They have strong self-esteem no matter what they're doing. But for many of us, it's what we say, it's a state. So in other words, you might feel very confident and full of self-esteem in one situation, but not another. So when I was growing up in classrooms, I felt completely confident answering any question a teacher would ask me, whether it was science, whether it was math, whether it was language arts, it didn't matter. But in gym class, I was the last runner in. I was the student who got the fewest baskets when we were playing basketball, that kind of thing. So that's an example. My self-esteem was very high in my academic classes and pretty low in gym class. And so that's an example of self-esteem as a state. Okay. Another aspect of personality is how anxious you are. And this has to do with how stress impacts you and what you do with the stress, whether or not you're able to calm yourself down, and just kind of where your dial is set in terms of how much it takes to set you off into anxiety, and whether or not you're able to calm yourself down. And notice here too that you see the words trait and state next to it. So some people, just their personality is set in such a way that they're just anxious. Every time there's an assignment, no matter what kind of assignment it is, they're anxious. They're worried that they're not going to get it done. They're not going to get it done correctly. They're not going to get it done on time. They're not going to please the instructor. So that's an example of anxiety as a trait. Now, anxiety as a state, it can be a situation where an instructor does not reach out to students to create an environment in which they feel comfortable asking questions, or an instructor who creates assignments that are only pass-fail, and maybe even the rubric for how to pass it is not clear, and students are afraid to even ask for more clarity on that. And so that would be an example of a situation in which that would certainly bring about anxiety. Now, one thing that we talk about in second language acquisition is that if the students in your classroom are completely free of any stress at all, they'll probably be asleep. You want students to have just a little bit of stress, enough that they are sitting up, they're paying attention, they're noticing when they understand and when they don't, and they're ready to do something to fix a lack of understanding. But that's a little bit different than anxiety. So yes, we want students to have just a little bit of stress, but we tend to think of stress as different than the word anxiety. And anxiety has a pretty negative connotation. And I think that pretty much we want to get rid of anxiety in second language learning situations. And you would want to reduce anxiety in your students as much as possible. So another aspect that we have of personality, or rather of internal factors, is motivation, and I have connected with that attitudes. And here is where we really begin to see differences in language learners make a huge difference in what they can do. So you might, for example, maybe sit in on a class of students who are learning a language, French or Spanish or English. You might sit in on the early weeks of a 101 class, so it's the beginning of fall quarter, and you go about your business for the rest of the year, and then you sit in 103, so in the spring, maybe halfway through. So students have had about 9 months of language learning. You might begin to see that two students who looked very similar in that week 3, suddenly in the third quarter they look very different. And often, in my experience, but also it shows up in second language research, it's often motivation that makes a difference. So motivation, I have that connected with attitudes because within motivation there are attitudes about whether or not you expect that your efforts are going to pay off. There are with attitudes about whether or not you will be successful. Like, are you in a situation where there's a level playing field? If you have students in a language learning situation and the teacher doesn't play fair, the teacher has maybe favorites, or the teacher has created a situation where if you come in with these characteristics, there's no way you can do well, then that would impact the student's attitude about whether or not it's a level playing field, which would impact motivation. Motivation is one of the key factors that you want to find a way to set fire for your students. And if they're not personally, they don't come into your classroom motivated, that is certainly something that you need to set off. Find a way to increase their motivation. It will pay off. Another factor that we think about when we're thinking about what makes one language learner different from another is what their first language is. So I've written on the graphic organizer L1, and that means first language. L2 would have mean, of course, second language. So here I'm talking about, for those who are learning English, what's their first language? So one thing that we'll look at in a course that you'll take in the spring, we'll take a look at what's called language distance. And this means how difficult is it to go from this language to this language. And what we know is it's not the same moving from Spanish to French, from French to English, from English to Japanese. All of those, if we were thinking about this in terms of distance, would be more distance or less distance. And in general, before we get to that course in the spring, just to give you a sense of that, in general, one of the things is what are the phonemes, what are the sounds that the language uses? If the phonemes from the first language and the phonemes from the second language are very similar, then that's going to bring in that language distance. Another aspect is how do you show plural? And that means more than one. How do you show past tense? In English, we show plural in general by adding an S. In English, in general, we show past tense by adding an ED. Of course, we have exceptions, as you know. And so other languages that also add an S, that also show, maybe not with an ED, but some other ending that's added on to the end of the verb, that would mean less language distance. If English adds these endings to show differences in grammar, differences in number, if a student is coming from a first language that does not use morphemes in that way, maybe never adds endings to words, that distance is going to be greater. So one of the things we pay attention to is what is that first language and how far is that distance? Another aspect that makes one language learner different from another is culture shock. Now, culture shock will come up in several of the courses that you take in this program for different reasons. In the 470 course, which is about preparing to go overseas, it's about how to survive culture shock. In our Cultural and Linguistic Diversity course, ESLG 489, there's information about culture shock, and it's about how different groups experience culture shock, or which groups might be more likely to experience more culture shock. But here the focus is, what is it? And how does that make a difference in language learning? So if you've got two students and one's in culture shock right now and one's not, how is that different? Well, one thing to know about culture shock immediately is that in popular culture, we think of it as something that happens when you're newly arrived in a new place, in a new culture, and also we think of it as it doesn't happen right away, but it happens a few days or a few weeks or a few months in. You live through it, and then it's like the flu. Once you get it, you don't get that kind of flu again. You're done with it. And that's not true. It's actually the opposite. Culture shock can occur for a student whenever moving from home to school means they're moving from one culture to another. So for example, if a student is born in the U.S. and home is a place where Spanish is spoken, and mom and dad create a home, a very loving home full of Mexican-American culture, then as that child goes to school every day, even if they were born in the U.S., they could experience culture shock. So it's not reliant on moving to a new place. It's whenever you experience in your daily life a difference in culture. Another thing that you need to know about culture shock is it's not like the flu. You get it once and you're done with it. It's very different than that. It can happen whenever things are just not going well. And what I've noticed in working with students over the years is that it tends to be when lots of little things are not going well. You have a little fight with your mom over the phone. You don't get a grade that you were hoping for. Your roommate doesn't clean the dishes yet again, and you feel like you're getting a cold. So all of those things, you can go through culture shock. So someone might be born in the U.S., and they're 15 years old, and they can be experiencing culture shock. And even though they might have experienced several times before. So it's cyclical, it's not dependent on moving to a new place. And why does it matter here? Why is it on this list? Because if you're experiencing culture shock, you are shutting down. Unless you or someone else interrupts the process, you're kind of shutting down. You're excluding yourself. You're staying quiet. So that means you're not seeking out language learning opportunities to use your new language. And you're keeping a distance from people, so you're kind of keeping yourself away from them. And you're not feeling too positively about this new culture, whether this is the culture of school, or whatever the difference is. And also packed in with that, you're not feeling so great about that new language. So you're not real excited to keep learning English because you associate it with this culture that you're not real happy with right now. So it can shut students down, it can interrupt their learning, it can actually cause intrusive thoughts. So they're sitting there, they are trying to pay attention to what you're doing, what you're explaining to the class, but they're having these intrusive thoughts that are tied up with the culture shock. So it can interrupt the language learning that's happening. So the last thing, the last internal factor that I want to talk to you about are language learning strategies. I think that our profession, the TESOL profession, is constantly moving forward. We're constantly trying out new ideas and thinking about kind of new frameworks to consider in what makes a difference in our language teaching. And I think it was a really positive move in about the 80s, the 1980s, in which we began to pay attention to if you have two language learners and one of them is really successful, here's the question: what is that student doing differently than the other student? And I think that's a powerful question, because if we can name the behaviors that that student who's successful is carrying out, we can then teach those behaviors, encourage those behaviors in the student who's struggling. And that's where language learning strategies research comes from asking that question. So a lot of work was spent figuring out, for those students who are excellent readers in English, what is it that they're doing when they're reading English? For those students who are excellent at listening in English, what is it that they're doing as they're listening in English? And so what we have here is we have a list of 6 of these language learning strategies. For each of them, they are kind of related to personality in that students will be more likely naturally on their own to be using one of these rather than the others. So they're very much tied up with who the student is, and it might be tied up with what are the educational experiences they've had until this point. Maybe all the previous teachers have taught them to use certain strategies, and they've taken those in, they've internalized them, and that's what they do. For example, they might come from a culture, an educational culture, that focuses on memory strategies. And so with whatever task you put in front of the students, where the strategy they want to try to apply is a memory strategy. Well, the problem is there's 5 others that can be very, very successful too. And sometimes memory strategies are not really what you need in a certain situation. If you're having a conversation with someone and you need on the street and you need to ask for directions, memory strategies might help you in terms of remembering what's the difference between left and right, what's the difference between street and avenue, that kind of thing, what's the difference between bank and post office. But there's a lot of other things you need to know too. For example, when we look on this list, you would need probably some compensation strategies. That's at the bottom of the list. And compensation means when things aren't working out, when you don't understand, what do you do? And compensation strategies are the kinds of things that we do to fix meaning breakdown. For example, I can tell you in Spanish, when I'm in Nicaragua, I ask a lot of questions. I check understanding a lot. I'll say, so you mean, and I'll try giving it back in Spanish and see if I get it right. I will often ask people to repeat things. I'm not shy about that. And so those are compensation strategies. So again, language learning strategies, the students who come to you, their dials are already going to be set naturally to be using 1 or 2 of these. But what we need to do is to help our students begin to understand that there's at least 6. And to begin to see how they can use these to support their language learning, and to encourage them to expand their repertoire, even if they really only want to use memory strategies, getting them comfortable with using the others. So we've talked about memory strategies, we've talked about compensation strategies. Let's look at metacognitive. When I think of metacognitive language learning strategies, I think of the control tower at an airport. And the reason that I think of that image, I think, is because the control tower is overseeing everything. The control tower is seeing what systems are in play, what's moving where, and the control tower is making decisions at not exactly a 10,000 foot level, but at least above the ground. And so metacognitive language learning strategies are things like planning, are things like setting up a study schedule, things like that. And so metacognitive strategies are all about the kind of making decisions at the 10,000 foot level about how you learn language. Another aspect is evaluating yourself, having a sense, like saying to yourself, okay, I had that English test today and I studied with a partner and I studied lists, but when I had to write an essay, it didn't help me at all. So what can I do differently so that I'm ready for the next language learning test? So it's almost like the manager in your brain overseeing what you're doing to learn language and how you're expressing that, and maybe rethinking those decisions, making different decisions. Saying you need to do more of this, you need to do less of that kind of thing. So that's metacognitive. Affective refers to emotion. How you control your emotions, how you control, and this connects back with anxiety, how you control your anxiety so that you're at the most optimal language learning kind of state that you can be. So, for example, an example of an effective strategy would be self-talk. If a student is very scared in your English class and the student for the first 30 minutes of every class refuses to speak, an effective strategy would be for that student to do some self-talk all the way from their dorm room or all the way from their home or all the way as they're walking on the street to your class, to be doing some self-talk, and you could even help them with that. What might that be? What might they be saying to themselves? Another strategy would be if that student sought you out, they came to class early and just chit-chatted, just had everyday conversation with you about what they did last night. So they get comfortable with you again and they get comfortable with hearing themselves speak English. So that would bring down their stress level. Another example of an effective strategy would be thinking about who in the class you feel most confident with and you feel comfortable with, and sitting next to that person, if you're allowed to change your seat, sitting next to that person. So finding out what brings your anxiety down, what makes you feel more confident. Social strategies are knowing how to use the people around you to learn better. So thinking about all the people who surround you as resources that can help you learn language. So figuring out that who the friendly people are who are just willing to talk with you for a few minutes every day. Knowing who you can call in your class or text in your class when you're not sure that you understood the homework assignment. Knowing which teachers are more friendly and you feel comfortable going to their office and just asking for additional help or just talking to get more access to English, that kind of thing. So social strategies, social language learning strategies means when a student looks around the people around them and knows how to use those people as resources to get them to the next place they want to be in their English learning.